Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and welcome to a very long overdue episode of Pokke's Classroom. And today we are going to be getting into the DN polling opinion for version 1.1 Wuthering Waves, Changli and Jinhsi, or Jinhsi and Changli. So without further ado, let's get into today's content. Subscribe! Alright, so the first unit in question is going to be Jinhsi. Let's just ignore that. Alright, so Jinhsi is going to be our spectral main DPS, burst damage dealer coming from her E4 and as well as ultimate. Decent grouping mechanic, main damage is derived from stacking incandescence. I have no idea how do I pronounce that shit. But the gist of how Jinhsi works is that she's like a Z, but not really like a Z, because the damage is not from her basic, it's not from her heavy, it is not even technically from her skill until her E4 and E3. As you guys would have known by now, if you guys have played Jinhsi, her skill has 4 different components, right? There's E1/E2, and then there's E3 and E4. So there's 4 different variations of a skill. So I'm just gonna talk about her skill. I'm not gonna go exactly in depth as to how her mechanics work. We're just gonna talk about that a little bit more in the Jinhsi analysis, but just very roughly speaking, you basically cast your basic attack 4 times to trigger her next skill, right? Casting your basic attack 4 times allows you to cast your E2. Casting E2 instantly allows you to cast E3. So after you cast E2, the skill button, it will glow up. Then you can cast E3, and then afterwards you do another 4 basic attack, which is enhanced, and then you'll cast E4, which is the big damage number. The E4 is when she summons Invincible Grenade and the dragon spits out laser and vomits an enemy and deals 5 billion damage, which is where all those big crazy damage multiplier come. It is all majority from the E4. Now, technically speaking, E3 does have a higher multiplier than E4, but that is without taking into consideration of incandescence. Okay, can I just call it ink? I'm just calling it ink, right? Without taking into consideration of ink, right? So at full stacks of ink, that's when E4 has ridiculous damage, because for every 1 point of ink, it increases E4's damage multiplier. Take note, this is damage multiplier and not damage percentage, right? So for every single 1 point you get from ink, E4 damage multiplier goes, which is why you see those nuclear nukes from E4, right? So that is basically how her damage is derived from. And one very interesting thing is that E2 onwards, so after you cast her glow, like, you know, after you cast her E2 and then you have a glowing thing, then she flies up, like she grows out the horns, and then she starts like low-key flying and floating. That's when her attack chain is not cancelled, which means you can do a basic attack 1 time, dodge, basic attack 1 time, dodge, basic attack 1 time, dodge, and it will still continue the full cycle of her 4 basic attacks, and then you can cast E4 again, which is very good, because this means that you can still dodge around hard difficult enemy counters and yet still perform your E4. Your E4 will not get interrupted, and you have to cast the final phase, the final basic attack, in order to trigger your E4, right? So this is very nice. All right, and then E4 also instantly allows you to trigger your ultra intro skill, which is absolutely insane, because most of the time you need to stack on full console energy, but now with Jinhsi's E4, like that shit, you can just go in, swap out anytime you want, right? So very nice. Ultimate is just basically a big nuke. Nothing to talk about. This is a very big nuke. Tons of damage, tons of damage, right? Very nice. Talent gains incandescence up to 50. Every point increase E4 multiplier, as well as how do you gain this incandescence is basically you gain 1 point from attacking per element. Insane. Every single element will have a 3-second cooldown. And then when you get 50 points, you deal big damage. Oh my god, insane. Yeah, so that's basically how you describe it, right? I'll get into the more nitty-gritty details in her unit guide, but I just really want to summarize this a little bit. And then her outro skill is basically you can instantly cast E2 into E3 without using your 4 basic attack, which drastically reduces her attack animation, her cycle. And you reduce the cooldown from the talent from 3 seconds to 1 second. Because otherwise, if you were the same element, for example, if your Verena attacks and then Jinhsi attacks at the same time, you can only get 1 stack, because it's within 3 seconds, right? But now that after you cast your auto skill, then you can cast it from every 1 second, which makes your building up your ink a little bit faster, right? And then supplementary forces is going to be Sanhua, Yang, and as well as Danjing. Sanhua, very good universal slot too. She's basically like our Tingyun, low-key, right? Very quick charges, stacks out console energy very fast. Ultimate is very quick. Basic attack buff, almost everyone can kind of use it. Kind of like the alternative version of Mortefi, right, if you will. And then Yang is basically going to be Yasuo, right? She has a innate grouping wind tornado that can suck in the enemies, so it's kind of like Yasuo. So pretty good for overall, right? Pretty good. And Danjing is pretty much going to be our, correct me if I'm wrong, strongest 4-star DPS that we have right now. she feels great to use, not just from like the damage multipliers, but just the overall piloting. You can check out my runs with Rexton, right? Just dungeons, parries, and all, it just feels great, right? Very, very nice 4-star, very, very nice main DPS, and you're not going to be disappointed with user. Right? So that's going to be a 4-star, very, very solid supplementary 4 stars, if I can say so myself. Upswing, insane. Right, so the verdict for Jinhsi, if you have no Jian and you have no other 3 other DPS, you definitely pull her. Sure, definitely pull, but the reason why she's not 10 out of 10, I'm going to explain that later, it's because she's a DPS. And we all know where that roll is gonna hit, right? So that's why she's not a 10 out of 10. But other than that, she's in fact our strongest DPS in the current version 1.1 patch as of we have right now. So let's go with that. But if you already have a spectral DPS, for example, if you're a spectral rover main, or if you are waiting for future spectral DPSs, then you don't really need to care about it, right? You don't want this damage, big damage markdown, you don't really care about it, because keep in mind, DPS, they will always be temporarily in the meta. Look at what happened to Jinhsi. Anyways, so Xian believes that Jinhsi do bring about a big balance change with her current result change 0 with one of the strongest DPS in the entire game. Superseding Jian, assuming no rest. This is, I am going to just bring up this screenshot very, very quickly. Very rough gauge. To be fair, it's not exactly fair because, you know, we are comparing Mortefi with Jian and Yingling with Jinhsi. So technically there's one more 5-star DPS. But overall team damage, you can see that at every benchmark, from E0 all the way to E6, Jinhsi has already outperformed Jian. So until Jian gets a more dedicated 5-star support, it is unlikely that this is going to change anytime soon. So take this with a slight pinch of salt, right? TLDR, her damage burst is absolutely ridiculous now. So she is the strongest E0 DPS bar none. Don't really have any other alternative that can even come close to what she can do. She also works quite well with a rainbow team, quote-unquote rainbow team, because of Ink. You can gain more stacks from different elemental sources. You get 1 stack. Then if you swap out and attack with Yingling, you'll get another stack instantly. So right now, she is gonna be quite flexible as a main DPS because her main gimmick, her main function is build up this ink stat, which is the circuit on top of the bar. Right? Build this stack up to 50 as fast as humanly possible. That's where you get the big nuke, the big boy damage. Going forward, she's slightly more flexible because you can insert pretty much any slot 2/slot 3s as long as they are a different element, and it allows her to stack up her stacks quickly enough to deal big nukes. In Wuthering Waves, being mono element or being non-mono element, it doesn't really change that much, but for Tower of Adversity, it might affect a little bit because Tower of Adversity buffs, they're directly tied to elemental damage, right? They're tied to, like for example, right now we have the electro damage buff as well as the spectral damage buff, which means it is applied to an entire team. So most of the time, if you're going to be running a mono team, you probably might deal more damage compared to like a rainbow team. But for Jinhsi, she kind of overcomes this point because as long as you build up your stacks fast enough, it doesn't really matter what your other elements are. So in a sense, she's a little bit more flexible to build as a main DPS, right? So there's that. And also one more thing to note is that she's currently not in her peak performance, right? Her current best in slot team is with Yingling and Verena, but they both have their inherent drawbacks. So this is not even her final form. This is not even her full potential. This is not even her power level 9000, right? Yingling's outro, there's not a lot of benefits to Jinhsi, right? Because 70% of the damage comes from her resonance skill, and Yingling buffs electro damage deepen as well as liberation damage deepen, right? So not really that useful. The only reason why Yingling is the best in slot right now is because pound for pound, Abuba for Abuba, Yingling does the highest coordinated attack damage out of any of our slot 2s right now. Higher than Mortefi, higher than Verena, higher than anyone. That's what Yingling. But if in the future we get another slot 2 that can also do a lot of coordinated attack damage, but at the same time buff, let's just say for example, resonance skill damage deepen, that will be a really good slot 2 for Jinhsi, right? But for now, Yingling is probably the best you have, so that's it. And then Verena, I think Verena is always great, right? She has all type damage buff, she has a heal, she has all the kind of stuff. But the slight drawback is that she is the same element as Jinhsi, which means that she will charge up Ink slightly slower. They are in the same element. There's a 3-second cooldown. Although if you were to trigger Jinhsi's intro/outro skill, then this cooldown drops down to 1 second. So it's not that big of a deal. Verena is overall just a great addition, but there can be someone stronger than Verena if in the future we get a Verena of a different element, right? So yeah, she's not even at her full potential. So very nice, very Pokke. So one thing before we move on to Changli is going to be some potential weaknesses, right? I didn't leave this potential weaknesses up for Changli, only for Jinhsi, because we have already seen how Jinhsi works and function. Number one is that DPS will never be future-proof in any gacha game, right? Which is also the reason why I didn't give Jinhsi a 10 out of 10, right? Always take that into consideration when putting for any DPS, despite Jinhsi being the strongest DPS now, right? Always take that into consideration. I don't believe that the term DPS or support DPS is going to be changing that much. Attack chains also slightly slow and slightly backloaded, which is the big bursts come from her E3 and E4. Her E2, her basic, not a very significant chunk, alright? So if you have a trouble reaching your E3/E4, so for example, if you're getting hit all the time, if you are not swapping enough, you're just parrying all the time and you're dodging before you can reach to E2, you might have a little bit of a difficulty getting up to E4 with high incandescence stacks or just pressing ultimate, right? So slightly backloaded, very slightly. Do note that pre-E2, when you dodge, it will cancel out the animation. I mentioned just now, post-E2, which is when she starts to fly up, when you dodge, it doesn't reset. But before you fly up, when you dodge, it will reset, right? So it may be a little bit annoying when you try to play with her, right? So that is that. Future DPS not tied by stack mechanics may have faster cycles leading to better comfort. So for example, if there's another DPS in the future that doesn't need this ink mechanic, which is stack up to 50, press E4, and then you just do ridiculous damage, then they might feel more comfortable to play, right? So that's gonna be that for Jinhsi. Moving on next. Fusion sub DPS question mark. There's a reason why I marked a question mark here, because I'll explain this a little bit more later on, right? But there is a possibility of Changli being a main DPS, and I'll explain this a little bit later on. She functions somewhat similarly to Yingling and Jinhsi with pretty much the exact same outro skill of Yingling, right? She has a fusion damage deepen as well as the liberation damage deepen, right? So both into one. Skill, 2 charges and instantly gains enflammement for the following basic attack after use the skill, right? That ultimate AoE damage and then instant gain 4 sets of enflammement. So enflammement is gonna be Changli's main mechanic, which is from a talent. Upon reaching 4 stacks of enflammement, you press a heavy attack, you will deal a big damage. And this big damage is also considered as skill damage, right? So the gimmick with Changli TLDR, her kit is get 4 enflammement, press heavy, big damage. Very simple, very easy to understand. Not a lot of thinking. Very anga banga unit, if you can say so myself, right? So outro skill, 20% fusion damage and 25% liberation. So very straightforward DPS. Not too much to be explained about. Supplementary 4-star is going to be Taoqi, Baichi, and Motefi. Baichi is the next best option as a healer behind Verena, while Motefi is just a great all-around slot 2, especially for DPS, focusing on heavy attacks. So very similar to Sanghua, very fast cycles, good heavy attack buff, all that kind of stuff. So overall, just a great DPS in general. Taoqi's buffs skill damage as her outro, but Taoqi's problem is that her rotations are very slow. She's also a more reactive DPS, so you might not get very consistent rotations with Taoqi, and rotations are the end all be all with any team comp. So even though her resonance skill damage buff is very high, because she charges conservative energy quite slowly and you need to get hit on kind of stuff, it might not feel as smooth to play, which is why a lot of players don't really find it nice to play with Taoqi, right? So it is what it is, but she does have a boba though. Alright, so the verdict for Changli is actually gonna be question mark if you're gonna be looking on sub DPS, and if you're not gonna be interested in fusion comps, then you just don't even pull for it, right? And the reason why it is because it's CN, they are a little bit confused, they're a little bit perplexed with Changli's kit as of version 1.1. We've already seen how Changli works in the story, the trial stage, right? My memory editor can drop me some footage here. Her outro skill being the same as Yingling may hint that she is a sub DPS, right? You buff your next DPS that comes in with fusion damage deepen as well as ultimate damage deepen, right? So she might look like a sub DPS, but the problem with this is she does not have any coordinated attack / off-field damage like Yingling, like Motefi, right? All these quote-unquote sub-DPS, you can still have a damage uptime if they are not on the field. Changli does not have this. It means that her damage has to be when she's on field. And if she is not on field, she has no real means of doing constant damage unless you make use of quick swaps, specifically with Encore. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that's just something to keep in mind. And also, Changli's ultimate cost is 150. Quite expensive, because to benchmark this, your Yingling ultimate is 125. Even your Jiyan ultimate is 125. So if you think of her as a sub DPS, it's gonna take a really long time to charge up to 150 energy as a sub DPS, because you're not even on the field, right? So yeah, CN is just very confused as to, is Changli a main DPS? Does she need to be on field for long periods, or does she need to be on field and off field for a short? So they are a little bit confused, but we're gonna see how this goes on further. Her current best slot 1 or teammate besides Verena, it's going to be with Encore. And Encore as a unit, she actively encourages quick swapping. Most of the time with Wuthering Waves, you might not want to abuse this that much because, as we know, if you were to swap out of a unit now, you lose the buffs from the outro skill, right? So most of the time, as long as you have the buff, you want to stay on field for like the full duration. For Encore, that's very different. You have a very big window to quick swap once you use Encore's enhanced heavy attack, right? The Cosmos Rupture, where she curses the ball and then she charges up like a fucking like a Voltorb and then she explodes and all kinds of stuff. So during this point, it is the perfect time to swap into Changli and do whatever Changli wants to do. So this team will likely perform very, very well because the Encore's DPS gap, this window where she can't do anything, it can be perfectly filled in by Changli. And then once Changli is done, you can then swap back to Encore. So this will rotate and cycle somewhat similar to Calchero and Yingling. A little bit, right? The difference between Calchero and Yingling is that Changli and Encore will have somewhat similar field up times. It's not like you use Changli for 2 seconds and then you dip. No, because Changli's damage comes from her being on the field. So it is quite likely that you will end up using both Changli and Encore with a similar amount of field duration before you swap in and out between both units, right? So further testing will be required, but TLDR, a little bit perplexed at what her kit is. It's like she have a low-key, a little bit of an identity crisis. Does she want to be a sub DPS? Does she want to be a main DPS? We'll stay tuned and find out, right? Because right now, we don't really have a good gauge since it is a story boss. We can't really test out in Tower of Adversity. We can't really test out with any other team comps. So it is what it is. But yeah, that is gonna be that for Changli. And the summary, if you're gonna be a Spectral main, you get Jinhsi. If you want to be a Fusion main, you get Changli. Because at the end of the day, they don't really exactly clash with one another. Jinhsi is our strongest DPS today, bar none. Every single DPS, multiplier by multiplier, rotation by rotation, they fall short of Jinhsi. Jinhsi's multipliers are just absolutely, completely fucking bonkers. And she has a lot of quality of life that previous DPSs do not have. So the biggest one being, the moment you cast her E4, you instantly trigger the next unit's intro outro skill. Absolutely bonkers. To be able to trigger your intro outro skill instantly, disregarding your console energy at all, which is very, very good, right? So there's a lot of quality of life that's tied to Jinhsi, and she has a lot of damage. But Changli, on the other hand, she does have pretty good damage, especially for Encore specifically, but I'm not exactly sure how her team is going to be performing if you don't use Encore, or if there's going to be a future Fusion DPS that also wants a lot of field uptime, then it might clash a little bit with Changli. So it's something to keep in mind. Overall, no clash. If you want to build a Spectral team, you go for Jinhsi, and then next time, that same player, if you want to build a Fusion team, you can just straight up just go for Changli, and then you have team 1 for Jinhsi, team 2 for Changli, and then team 3 you can just run like Yingling Culture or something like that, right? Or team 3 can run like a Jiyan with multi-V, right? So there's not a lot of clashes here. You're probably not going to be running Jinhsi and Changli in the same team, so there's going to be that. And consider this, right? Tower obviously it buffs elemental damage as a whole, so being on the right element, it will always be a good way to plan for future pools. And in Wuthering Waves, being off element is a very, very big debuff. Example, the Crownless right now, the brand new hologram boss, is 80% Havoc Rest. So being off element in Wuthering Waves is a very, very, very big debuff. So it doesn't really hurt that much to have a little bit more of a bigger repertoire, a bigger library of units that you can use to your arsenal. So one final note to move on. Remember to always account actual party experience, right? The field is a Shogun, right? The Shogun is always going to be the #1 priority because it doesn't matter if the unit deals a shit ton of damage. If you doesn't feel good to use as a player, if you feel, oh my god, it's so clunky, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, right? Regardless of the theoretical damage output, and this will vary between players, so that is gonna be up to the player's difference, right? So with that, we have come to the end of today's content. If you guys are engaged in any further discussion, hit on the comments below or join the Discord.gg for possibly wherever and what is on a daily basis. Onto my stream. That's twitch.tv for all the best for your Jinhsi pools. All the best for your Singaporean pools. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.